Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tandem HR's first quarter webinar, Sexual Identity in the Workplace. My name is Carrie Storzinski. I am a senior HR consultant at Tandem, and I will be your presenter for today. And then if you do have any questions, feel free to type those in, and if there's any time, we'll try to answer those questions at the end. Otherwise, I can always reach out to you separately. So today we're going to be talking mainly about gender identity and transgender employees. So this is our agenda for the day. We're going to go through some definitions. We'll talk about the history of LGBT rights and some statistics with LGBT employees in the workplace. We'll go over federal and state employment laws. We'll talk about some employer practices you can put into play so that your organization is compliant. We'll talk about some recent court cases as examples of what's been going on with transgender employees and discrimination in the workplace. And lastly, we'll talk about how having transgender employees at your workplace will ultimately help your organization to be more successful. Nearly every human society throughout history has distinguished between male and female gender through appearance and behaviors, whether that be hairstyles or clothing, maybe accessories, and typically each gender has also had a stereotype with how one should act. In the past, it was pretty common to believe that men were not suited to be primary caregivers for children, and to some, women playing sports was considered too masculine for proper ladies. Think about how significantly gender roles have shifted over time and how they can shift from culture to culture. Now men are much more involved in their children's lives and have a larger role in the home life, and women are at the workplace more and have taken on activities that were once considered male activities like sports. Sometimes when a person does not conform to gender stereotypes, even today, reactions can range from silent disapproval to verbal taunting and even escalating to harassment. With today's presentation, hopefully you'll learn that in the workplace, we need to not take into consideration about the past stereotypes or cultural opinions of gender roles. Even though some employees may have their personal beliefs about gender identity, just like any other factors of a person's background, this should not play a role in the workplace. So first, let's talk about some definitions so everyone has a background and you understand the terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation. First, sex, either of two main categories, male and female, into which humans and many other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. So this is a medical or a biological classification for each person. Next is gender. This is the state of being male or female, typically used with reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones. Next, we have sexual orientation. Refers to an individual's physical and or emotional attraction to the same and or opposite gender. We don't talk about this topic too much during our presentation, but it is touched upon. And then gender identity refers to a person's innate, deeply felt psychological identification as a man, woman, or some other gender, which may or may not correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. Transgender is the umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. And gender transition is the process that some transgender people go through to begin living as the gender with which they identify, rather than the sex assigned to them at birth. This may or may not include hormone therapy, sex reassignment surgery, or other medical procedures. So you don't have to medically change your sex in order to go through a gender transition. So now we're going to do a poll from the audience. I just want to get a better idea of the experience that the audience has had with transgender employees. So if everyone could answer here, have you handled a situation with a transgender employee at your company? Yes or no? Okay, a few more people are answering. And then I have one more question. Okay, and then the next question. How comfortable would you feel if a current employee told you that he or she plans to go through a gender transition? Would you feel very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, but you can get through it, or not at all? You wouldn't have a clue how to handle this. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, so let's see the results. Okay, so the first question, so it looks like the majority of the audience has not had experience with a transgender employee at your company. And then the next one, so, okay, it seems like a lot of people would feel somewhat comfortable. A lot of people feel very comfortable and a few not at all. Okay. Then we'll move on, and hopefully everyone will feel very comfortable at the end of our presentation. So now that you have a better understanding of the definition surrounding gender identity, let's go through some statistics in the U.S. So that you have a better understanding of how prevalent the topic is. And as you can see, some people have had this experience and some have not, but I'm sure it will pop up in your organization soon, so it's best to be prepared. I refer to LGBT in my presentation, which is a term that some of you may or may not recognize, but that's short for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender group. 4% of the U.S. workforce identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. 21% of LGBT employees report having been discriminated against in hiring, promotions, and pay. 47% of transgender employees report similar discrimination at work. So that's a very high number just to think that 1 out of every 2 transgender employees suffer some sort of discrimination. Gay and bisexual men make 68 to 90 cents for every dollar earned by a similarly qualified heterosexual man. And 1 out of every 25 complaints made out of workplace discrimination comes from LGBT employees. 66% of Fortune 500 companies have policies that prohibit discrimination based on gender identity. These companies employ nearly 25 million people in the U.S. and have many other applicants wanting to work for them. These are the companies that a lot of other companies look up to and may want to model part of their business after. Normally, these companies get their top choice of talent when it comes to recruiting because of their status and lead the way with trends. So I'm sure more companies are to follow this trend. So I wanted to give you some background on the evolution of American LGBT rights, which is very eye-opening to me when doing research for this presentation, because it is astonishing how much has changed over the years. Also, to understand the transformation, hopefully you understand that the future is not as expected as you might think it is. So let's go through some of the highlights I have listed here. On December 10th, 1924, the Society for Human Rights is founded by Henry Gerber in Chicago. The society is the first gay rights organization as well as the oldest documented in America. In November of 1950, in Los Angeles, gay rights activist Harry Hay founds America's first national gay rights organization. This organization aimed to eliminate discrimination and bigotry and tried to assimilate homosexuals into mainstream society and to cultivate the notion of an ethical homosexual culture. On December 15th of 1950, the Senate issued a report stating that since homosexuality is a mental illness, Yes, at that time, homosexuality was considered a mental illness. Homosexuals constitute security risks to the nation. Over the previous few years, more than 4,380 gay men and women had been discharged from the military, and around 500 fired from their jobs with the government. The purging will later become known as the Lavender Scare. So the government actually proactively discharged any homosexual employee that is discovered. In 1953, President Eisenhower signs an executive order banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. On September 21st, 1955, in San Francisco, the Daughters of Bilitis becomes the first lesbian rights organization in the U.S. And in 1962, Illinois becomes the first U.S. state to decriminalize homosexuality. 1973, the Board of American Psychiatric Association votes to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illness. 1982, Wisconsin becomes the first U.S. state to outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In 1996, President Clinton signs the Defense of Marriage Act into law. The law defines marriage as legal union between one man and one woman that no state is required to recognize same-sex marriage from out of state. And then in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act as unconstitutional. Gay couples legally married in their states will now be granted federal benefits such as family leave and Social Security survivor benefits. So hopefully I chose some highlights that point out the drastic changes in American history on this topic, and I bet it's not ending here. And then next, I have just a map of the U.S. that shows marriage equality and those states that allow same-sex marriage. All the red allow same-sex marriage. The bright red are the states in which same-sex couples are legally married prior to a court stay. Next, let's talk about the EEOC. That's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is the federal agency that enforces the federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against a job applicant or employee because of a membership in a protected class, or retaliate against any individual who may have filed a complaint. The EEOC is a free resource to employees to go to if they feel like they've been discriminated because of a membership in a protected class. The EEOC chooses to represent certain employees in lawsuits against companies. Employees always have the option to sue a company on his or her own, but will most likely start with the EEOC because it is a free resource to them. So next, I have the protected classes listed, the federally protected classes under the EEOC, and then I want to focus on sex, this one protected class, as part of our presentation today. Sex discrimination involves treating someone, either an applicant or employee, unfavorably because of that person's sex. Sex discrimination also can involve treating someone less favorably because of his or her connection with an organization or group that is generally associated with people of a certain sex. Although Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not explicitly include sexual orientation or gender identity, the EEOC and courts have said that sex discrimination includes discrimination because an applicant or employee does not conform to the traditional gender stereotypes. It has also been determined that sexual orientation has been covered under sex discrimination as well. For example, it's illegal for an employer to deny employment opportunities or permit harassment because a woman does not dress or talk in a feminine manner, a man dresses in an effeminate manner or enjoys a pastime like crocheting that is typically associated with women, a female employee dates women instead of men, a male employee plans to marry a man. An employee transitions from female to male or male to female. So just because a protected class is not specifically listed does not mean that it cannot be categorized into another protected class and enjoy the same protections under federal laws. Courts have gone both ways on the topic of transgender cases, but I will give you some tips based on what we've learned so far from recent court cases and guidance from the EEOC. I have another map here to show you the additional state-specific protected classes. In addition to the federal agency and the federal protected classes, states have their own agencies that usually have additional laws and protected classes. In Illinois, the agency is the Department of Human Rights. Illinois does have a protected class of sexual orientation, which includes gender identity. You can also see other states throughout the U.S. that either have sexual orientation, gender identity, or both as protected classes. If you have employees in states other than Illinois, you need to be aware of these additional protected classes and any other classes that are specific to that state. So you can see the purple states are those that cover sexual orientation and gender identity, and the, I guess, lavender states are those that covers only sexual orientation. So now that you understand the background regarding LGBT rights and how federal and state governments protect these classes, let's discuss your role as an employer and how you should proactively prevent discrimination and what should you do when a transgender employee works for you. Overall, the employer has a liability to ensure that its policies are not discriminatory against any employee or job applicant on the basis of a membership in a protected class, including gender identity. We're going to go through components of an anti-discrimination policy, other applicable laws, restrooms, dress code policies, names and pronouns, and confidentiality and privacy. So first, all companies should have an anti-discrimination policy that states the company prohibits discrimination or harassment. With your anti-discrimination policy, it's a good idea to define sex and gender so that it is clear that these are not the same thing, and an employee's biological sex is not important information when it comes to gender identity. By specifically referencing gender identity or gender expression in your policy, it sends a clear message that all employees will be respected and able to work free of any kind of harassment, and that no form of harassment or offensive conduct directed at individuals based on gender identity will be tolerated. Employees may not understand the differences between gender and sex or what gender identity is. So if an employer expects employees to abide by this policy, then it must be explained well enough to ensure that everyone understands it. So that's why it's a good idea to provide those definitions. A lot of times policies and laws work in coordination with each other. So I want to go through ADA and FMLA, as these may be topics that come up with a transgender employee or an employee going through a gender transition. So first, Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. This law applies to employers with 15 or more employees. They are required to abide by this act. And the Family Medical Leave Act applies to employers with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. So the ADA prohibits employers from discriminating against a qualified individual on the basis of disability. Also, the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodation to the known disability of a qualified individual, unless to do so would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. The ADA's definitions of disabilities do not include transvestitism, transsexualism, gender identity disorders not resulting from physical impairments, or other sexual behavior disorders. However, Some transgender individuals may suffer from depression or other medical conditions that could be covered under the Act. So if a transgender employee asks for an accommodation, I recommend going through the normal interactive process so that employee has the opportunity to request an accommodation, and the employer can determine if that specific condition will qualify under the Act. Now let's talk about FMLA. Some treatments and procedures for transgender employees may not qualify for employment leave under FMLA, but others may. The employer should follow normal notification procedures and review each certification to determine if the employee qualifies. Currently, in order to qualify for FMLA leave, a transgender employee must have a serious health condition related to their transgender status or be receiving treatment for gender identity disorder. According to the Act, a serious health condition is an illness, injury, impairment, or other physical or mental condition that involves inpatient care in a hospital or continuing treatment by a healthcare provider. Examples of treatment that may qualify as a serious health condition would include sex reassignment surgery requiring overnight hospitalization, continued counseling, or hormone therapy. However, each instance is fact-specific, and no current clarifying law or regulation exists that addresses gender transition treatment specifically. It's also worth noting that some government agencies have begun to find treatments associated with gender transition not medically necessary, so that would not qualify under FMLA, so make sure to do your research first. The big question that comes up with transgender employees is which bathroom should the employee use? The employee should be allowed to choose the restroom associated with the gender that the employee identifies with. Employers should never mandate which restroom the employee should use, as this may be seen as discriminatory. If you have a single stall or single occupant unisex restroom, this is a great option for the transgender employee or any other employee at your company. Employers can make suggestions or offer options to an employee as to which restroom or changing facilities are available, but ultimately mandating which facility to use should not be the answer. Sometimes coworkers are uncomfortable with sharing a restroom with transgender employees. In that case, employers should direct the employee to take advantage of those single occupant facilities. It's unlikely that an uneasy employee will successfully sue an employer simply for being made to share a bathroom with a transgender coworker or to use that single occupant facility. However, if an employer forces transgender employees to use facilities that correspond to their birth gender instead of their chosen gender, that employer risks a lawsuit. There really is no litigation regarding dress code, but there is a risk for future litigation, and employers need to be educated and prepared, and I'll share some guidance for you when preparing your dress code policy. Generally speaking, employers have the right to establish employee dress and grooming guidelines during work hours if they are reasonable and serve a legitimate business purpose. So some of those purposes may include maintaining a certain image with customers and competitors, so you want to keep that professional image. Safety, such as requiring employees to wear closed-toed shoes, goggles, or gloves. And visibility, requiring employees to wear uniforms so that they are clearly recognizable to the public, like security guards. In the vast majority of cases, employers do not have the right to monitor or regulate employees' off-the-job conduct. Dress code should not apply to activities outside of work. While some transgender employees may cross-dress outside of work, including cross-dressers and employees considering or beginning the process of transitioning genders, the employer should not ask about this activity or take any type of adverse action against the employee should you learn about this cross-dressing outside of work. A dress and grooming policy that has different requirements for men and women may be challenged because the requirements for one sex are typically based on stereotypes. In addition, employers should be mindful of whether requirements for one sex are more burdensome than those for the other. For example, if a dress code requirement is more extensive for women, like it mandates a certain type of hairstyle, that they should wear stockings, about their fingernails or cosmetics, women could potentially claim they are being treated differently from their male counterparts. So dress code should be developed as gender neutral, and same rules should apply to both genders. Don't offer suggestions or mandate different dress options for men and women, like saying women may wear dresses or skirt suits and men may wear collared shirts. You can make general suggestions to all employees, like appropriate dress for our business casual dress code includes slacks, collared shirts, dresses, or skirts. So you're not specific as to which gender or sex should wear which piece of clothing. You can also apply restrictions like no shorts or skirts should be worn that are of a certain length. It is within the employer's control to apply a policy that maintains a professional working environment through the dress code policy, but make sure it applies to all genders. When an employee transitions to a gender that is different than their biological sex and requests to update their gender in the company system, there should be no hesitation or request for medical documentation. There is no legal support that allows employers to request such information. The employee should be able to list the gender that he or she identifies with. Most transgender individuals adopt a name during their transition that better represents their gender identity and expression. This is no different than an employer allowing employees to use nicknames during business practice. So an employee who is legally named Rebecca only identifies with the name Becky. Becky is not her legal name, yet employers have no problem allowing the use of nicknames in email addresses and on business cards or company ID cards. However, name changes on legal documents like benefit enrollment plans and I-9 forms should remain the employee's legal name until it has been legally changed. It will certainly take time to adjust to an employee's transition to a different gender, especially if that employee has been with the company for a while and has been referred to as another gender. There needs to be an understanding on both ends with this process. I think a discussion with the employee who is transitioning to a different gender is acceptable to explain that it may take time for coworkers to adjust. It's fine for the employee to politely correct a coworker if he or she uses the employee's former name or former gender pronoun. But if employees or managers are intentionally misusing the employee's new name or pronoun or making references to the former gender, that may be seen as harassment. Not all employees need to agree with their coworkers' decision to transition to a different gender, but they do need to be respectful and acknowledge the change in gender and the possible name change. Just like all other personal or medical related information of employees, most information surrounding the gender identity of an employee should remain confidential. I do not have much to say on this topic because this should already be a policy of your company to keep personal information confidential, so a classification of someone's gender is no different. Outside of a possible communication to employees regarding a current employee's gender transition, which we'll talk about on the next slide, you should let the employee share what information he or she wants. If a newly hired transgender employee starts at your company, everyone will have only known that person as one gender. However, it's a different situation when a current employee decides to go through the gender transition process while employed. Typically, when an employee decides to start the process, he or she will confide in an HR professional or perhaps a direct supervisor. Each transition is unique to the person going through it, so one-size-fits-all approach is not a good idea, but it is a good idea to have a plan in place to guide you through the process. The goals of a transition plan are to provide for a safe and healthy process for the transgender employee and to integrate the employee into the workplace without stigmatization. It's critical to include the transitioning employee in the process of creating the transition plan from the beginning and to monitor the adjustments of the employee and the coworkers throughout the process and follow up after transition. So the first step would be the initial meeting between the employee and hopefully preferably the HR professional. This is a time to talk to the employee about what he or she and the organization should expect through the transition process. The employee should disclose his or her wishes regarding the communication to the staff and the timing of the transition. And there should be a leader in the process, again, preferably human resources. Next is the initial management meeting. So the leader of this process should hold a separate meeting with the person's supervisor to give the supervisor information about the plan and to review the company's policy and procedures, specifically the harassment and discrimination policies. The manager should be instructed to keep the information confidential. The manager should also be given guidelines on which questions to answer and how, and which questions not to answer if that person should receive questions from the rest of the staff. For example, if an employee asks a manager which restroom the transitioning employee will be using, the manager can answer that. If an employee asks the manager if the transitioning employee is medically changing his or her gender, the manager should not answer this, as it is confidential and it's not even relevant to the situation. Just like all other signs of harassment or discrimination, the manager should be aware of acts of discrimination or harassment and act in accordance with the anti-discrimination policy. Then you want to have a joint meeting with the employee and supervisor to go over the transition plan and address any questions or concerns. And then the last step is to inform coworkers. Employees who have regular contact with the transitioning employee need at least basic information about the individual's plan, along with a reminder about the company policy, expected behavior, and how to deal with any concerns they might have. So you don't necessarily have to tell the whole company, but you will have to give some information to those employees that do have that regular contact with the transitioning employee. Experts also advise that it can be helpful if the transitioning or transgender employee is not at these sessions when you communicate this to your employees, so those employees feel more comfortable asking questions. When and how to notify employees about a coworker's gender transition requires careful consideration of the dynamics and the culture of the workplace and the personal preferences and privacy concerns of the transitioning individual. As mentioned previously, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Each transgender individual is likely to have a different preference about the communication plan. One employee may prefer a quick start in which all his or her coworkers are informed about the transition at the end of the work week, and the employee comes to work the following week presenting as their new gender role. Another employee may prefer a more gradual transition in which coworkers are notified of the transition, but the employee does not actually present in the new gender role for several weeks. However, in both cases, the leader of the process is responsible for helping each transitioning employee and the employee supervisor and the rest of the staff manage that process. It's important to remember that this is a sensitive issue for the employee and coworkers. You want to help everyone get through this process as comfortable as possible. By having transgender employees at your workplace, this will enhance the diversity at your company. A diverse workplace includes employees with different backgrounds, like including people of different ages, genders, socioeconomic statuses, and beliefs. Although it's more difficult to handle a diverse workplace, the company will ultimately benefit from different viewpoints or experiences or work styles. Diversity in workplace means that employees should be able to work with all people, does not require that employees believe in or accept transgenderism. Employees are entitled to their beliefs, but they should also be required to treat the transgender person just like every other person at the company with respect and tolerance. To reduce negative reactions to gender transition, the organization consider providing training. Training may help employees understand different cultures and types of people, and hopefully learn how to work better with different types of people. By not understanding, employees may have unfounded negative opinions about a certain type of person or group. They may try to avoid that person or group or treat them negatively. By expanding the knowledge of your employees through training, perhaps a diversity training, employees can begin to better work with each other and accept their coworkers in the workplace. Lastly, as mentioned throughout the presentation, employers should always promote a harassment-free workplace. At the very minimum, this should be the standard to all employees, so all employees feel comfortable in coming to work each day and free of harassment. Managers should always be on the lookout for signs or acts of discrimination or harassment and act upon those. No matter how small the act is, it should not go unaddressed, especially if it is something small now that could escalate to something much larger in the future. So you want to make sure you address it right away. So I want to give you some tips for employees if any coworkers come to you with specific concerns. First, advise them to demonstrate respect. Transgender coworkers do not expect any special treatment. They simply want their identity to be respected. This often means they want to be addressed by the name and pronoun that reflects their gender identity. If you're unsure of what pronoun to use, you can politely ask your coworker how they would like to be addressed. Also, just like all coworkers, transgender people do not want other employees talking about them behind their backs or making fun of them, which also could potentially create a hostile work environment. So treat your coworkers the way you want to be treated. Recognize the difference between your personal values and the community values of your workplace. Some people have political, cultural, and religious objectives to someone being transgender. Being polite and respectful to a transgender coworker does not require abandoning these beliefs. Instead, being polite simply requires that these beliefs are not acted upon in the workplace. After all, transgender and non-transgender people alike want to be treated respectfully. The best way to do that is to separate out private values from workplace conduct. Next, respect your coworkers' confidentiality and privacy. Many non-transgender people have a lot of questions about their coworkers' gender transition. However, it's inappropriate to ask a coworker questions about their private medical history. Some coworkers will feel comfortable enough to discuss private matters, but don't assume that your transgender coworker will want to discuss that with you. Instead, allow your coworker to initiate the conversation about their transition. Help coworkers who are having trouble with another employee's transition. Sometimes one of your non-transgender coworkers may be having difficulty showing respect to their coworker. The person may mistakenly use a transgender coworker's old name out of habit and may need to be gently reminded about the new name or pronoun. Other times, the person may have trouble separating their personal values from the community values of the workplace. In those instances, it is helpful if you talk to them about their behavior and how it not only affects the transgender coworker, but it probably makes other people feel uncomfortable as well. This also shows support to your transgender coworker if you correct other coworkers who may be misusing the employee's pronoun or name. And don't assume that your transgender coworker knows everything about all transgender issues. While some transgender coworkers may have a special interest in discussing transgender-related issues, others may not. Some may not want to discuss the topic at all and not bring any more attention to it than needed. Before bringing it up, make sure that your coworker really wants to discuss these things. What you may find is that you have other shared interests that they'd much rather discuss. Just because someone is transgender does not mean that they wish to discuss every transgender-related issue that may arise. So now I want to talk about a couple of examples here with recent court cases having to deal with gender stereotyping and transgender employees. First one is Waterhouse versus Hopkins. Ann Hopkins was a senior manager at Waterhouse. When she was refused a partnership, she sued under Title VII, alleging that the firm had discriminated against her on the basis of sex. So here's some background of the case. Of the 662 partners at the firm, only 7 were women. Of the 88 candidates for partner, all others were male. She had the best record of generating new business and securing multi-million-dollar contracts for the firm. Although she was described by many as a competent leader and a hard worker, she was also described as sometimes being overly aggressive, harsh, and difficult to work with. Many male partners considered her to be too macho and in need of charm school. She was also told that in order to improve her chances for partnership, she should walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely, wear makeup, have her hairstyles, and wear jewelry. Instead of pursuing a partnership with the company, she quit and sued the company under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act for sex discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court held that Waterhouse had based its decision in part on unlawful sex stereotyping. Not only did the company have to fight a legal battle, which always results in a high cost and lost productivity, but the company suffered horrible publicity. Sometimes it takes more time and money to bounce back from a dent in a company's reputation than the actual legal action itself. If the company had stuck to job-related performance factors, I'm sure this case would never have happened. Also, as we have learned, Waterhouse should not have mandated how Hopkins should change her appearance in accordance with gender stereotypes. The next one is Macy versus Holder. Mia Macy was a detective for the Phoenix Police Department and expressed an interest in moving to California in late 2010. So Macy's supervisor at the time recommended her for an ATF job at the Walnut Creek Laboratory. Macy said the section chief there told her the job was hers pending the outcome of her background check. At the time, however, Macy identified as a man and began the background check process using former male names. Her background check proceeded until late March or early April 2011, when she informed the company handling the process that she would be reporting to work as a woman. Within hours of receiving documentation of Macy's new name in April 2011, a supervisor at the ATF laboratory stopped the routine background investigation and canceled her hire. After filing a claim and having to appeal, the EEOC commissioners ruled that discrimination claims based on transgender status are covered under the law's prohibition of sex discrimination. The decision meant that a full investigation into Macy's claims would proceed within the Justice Department. A final decision was made in 2012 affirming Macy had been discriminated against. In light of the EEOC's decision in this case to hold that actions based on transgender status are actions based on sex and therefore covered by Title VII. The ATF's actions were considered discrimination based on sex and therefore prohibited by Title VII. The outcome of this case resulted in the ATF offering her position back. She received back pay, corrective action to prevent any future discrimination at ATF laboratory, damages, and attorney fees. The decision to revoke her hire was very soon after she disclosed she was transgender, especially after pretty much being guaranteed the job. The EEOC found it clear that this was the reason she was not hired and declared this discrimination. The next one is Saxon Company. This is a case that has just started. There is no resolution yet, but I do want to mention it so you can keep a lookout for it. A transgender woman named Lace Jamal alleged that she was instructed to separate her home life from her work life by behaving in a more masculine way, and coworkers at a sex store in Houston referred to her as a man and forced her to use the men's bathroom. Ultimately, Jamal was terminated because she spoke up about a hostile work environment claimed by Jamal. Saks filed their motion on December of last year and denied Jamal's allegations. In their motion, they state that Jamal identifies as transsexual, an identity not covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The company received a lot of negative response from the public, including the Human Rights Campaign and National Center for Lesbian Rights. Saks later withdrew its statement that transgender employees were not protected from discrimination under Title VII. The retailer still plans to fight Jamal's lawsuit, but have retracted that statement where they said transgenders are not covered under the law. So keep a lookout for that. And then a couple other lawsuits. The two lawsuits filed separately in federal courts in Florida and Michigan accused two employers of discriminating against transgender employees. In the Florida case, Lakeland Eye Clinic fired Brandy Branson after she started dressing as a woman. The clinic hired Branson in 2010 when she presented as a man. When terminating Branson, the clinic said it was eliminating her position, but it hired a male employee to replace Branson 2 months later, the lawsuit claims. In the Michigan case, a funeral home allegedly fired a funeral director and embalmer, Amy Stevens, 2 weeks after she told her employer and colleagues that she was transitioning to a woman and would start dressing in female attire. So we'll have to wait to hear more information about these cases, but this is a huge step with the EEOC filing its first 2 lawsuits against private employers for transgender issues. My thoughts are more are to come. Throughout the presentation, I explained a lot of don'ts and how to keep your company out of trouble. However, there are benefits to companies that embrace diversity in their organization, including transgender employees. This can actually boost your bottom line, which is ultimately the goal of all companies. Inclusion is different than diversity because diversity is having all those kinds of employees at your workplace and reaping the benefits of those differences. Inclusion involves proactive behaviors that make each person feel welcome and part of the organization. Like all workers, transgender employees will be happier and more productive in a positive, supportive working environment, and it will also increase employee morale. This will in turn enhance your corporate reputation. Many companies want to be on the list of best companies to work for. This is one of the ways that companies achieve this. Also, other highly rated and well-known companies want to do business with other companies who are up to their status. So you may be able even to get more business by having this type of environment. As I stated earlier, 66% of Fortune 500 companies make it against their policy to discriminate against an employee because of gender identity. Additionally, it will enhance your internal reputation with your employees. Employees will feel more comfortable working at your company and will promote your organization. Especially nowadays where employees have many outlets on the internet and social media to talk about their opinions about working at an organization, you want to make sure that you manage your internal reputation as well. It will also help with recruiting and retention efforts. A lot of those Gen X and millennials in particular expect a diverse environment. And many members of the LGBT group will recognize that your company values transgender employees, and members of that group and supporters of that group will want to work for your company and will want to support your company. You'll have a bigger pool of talent to choose from, and also studies show that employees who feel valued at work normally stay at their current employer and are more productive. And lastly, of course, it will decrease your vulnerability by having a diverse and inclusive environment that values employees of all backgrounds. This will give you the opportunity to focus on your core competencies instead of legal matters, which nobody wants to do. So hopefully it provided a lot of helpful information to you in our last hour together. So I just have a few points that hopefully you take away from our presentation today. Although transgender is not listed specifically as a federally protected class, it is still covered under Title VII as sex discrimination. Allow the employee to identify with a gender that is different than their biological sex. Allow them to use the restroom for the gender that they identify with. It's a good idea to update your anti-discrimination policy to include gender identity and make sure your dress code policy is gender neutral. If a current employee is transitioning to a different gender, be prepared with a plan so it goes smoothly and it's comfortable for everyone. And remember, a one-size-fits-all approach is not the best way to go. And lastly, if you embrace this, there are benefits for the employee and the company. Employees will feel valued and comfortable at work. Employers will benefit from a more productive workforce that will help the company to ultimately be more successful. Okay, and we're coming up to our hour here. We have a few more minutes. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions here. And we don't have too much time to go through them all, so I'll address one of them. How would you handle an employee with a strong religious belief having difficulty accepting this employee? Again, we kind of mentioned this in the presentation that you don't have to accept that person's decision as to be transgender or transition to a different gender. You just need to treat that person with respect and not discriminate against them or harass them. So we're not asking all employees to accept or change their beliefs, but they just need to be respectful and maintain that respectful working environment. I'm sorry, I'm just looking through the questions here. And then another question is, what would you do if an applicant tells you that he or she is transgender? So the person comes out and tells you this. I guess I would treat that the same way you would treat a situation when you would receive any other type of background information. Sometimes during an interview, an applicant will just tell you about maybe their family or their religious beliefs, or something that you may not have asked about, but they just provide that information. So I would treat that the same way. Just kind of smile and move on. Don't ask any other questions about it. If the person still has concerns about working at your company, I would address those and make sure to reiterate the discrimination and harassment policy, and that we don't tolerate that at the company, but I wouldn't ask any more questions about it.